Hello and welcome to the Vaults of Terra. My name is Ed and today we're going to be continuing our Imperial Guard videos by having a look at the Imperial Guard Armoury. Specifically, we'll be looking at the Imperial Guard vehicles. Now, we won't be looking at their air vehicles in this video because that will go into our Imperial Navy video that will be added at the end of the Imperial Guard block of videos. Now, the Imperial Guard are most renowned for their vehicles. It's one of the main reasons people collect their army in the Warhammer 40,000 game is because they are able to field a vast variety of armoured vehicles compared to the Space Marines, who are another Imperial faction. Now, the Imperial Guard vehicles will be broken up into their different classifications in this video, and we'll be starting with their light vehicles, then moving on to the tanks, and then super heavy vehicles that are later down the line. Now, to start the Imperial Guard light vehicles, we will go with the Imperial Guard bike. Now, it's not something you see very commonly in the Imperial Guard, but it's actually a vehicle that's used by more, you could say, civilized regiments of Imperial Guard, as opposed to using horses or other beasts as rough riders. They use bikes, which are similar to the early to mid-20th century bikes used by militaries in the Second World War. Now, another light vehicle used by the Imperial Guard is the Centaur, which uses a Leman Russ chassis and is actually an artillery tow. So tows larger pieces of artillery that is used by the Imperial Guard onto the field of battle, which can then be fixed in place and fire at an enemy at a fixed distance away. It can also be used as a light armoured transport for grenadiers and other similar units, so that they can get into battle quickly, fire off their ammunition without restrictions from a normal armoured vehicle, then depart quickly once their ammunition has been depleted. Another light vehicle used by the Imperial Guard is a Cyclops demolition vehicle. Now, this is more of a remote unit than an actual vehicle. It's a very small tracked unit that is used to destroy defences and structures. It's actually loaded with explosives and then suicide charged into the structure itself, exploding and bringing down the structure or the bunker in order for the larger armour or even infantry to go in and deal with the enemy behind the defences. Now, another popular Imperial Guard light vehicle is the Sentinel. Now, it resembles one of the bipedal walkers from the Star Wars series, but it's a lot smaller and it actually has a single pilot inside, although it can be modified to hold two pilots. This is a light scouting vehicle used to go on all sorts of terrains which would be too rugged for a standard tracked or wheeled vehicle, and can scout out the enemy movements and also have ranged weapons on them such as multi-lasers or autocannons used to deal a lot of damage to infantry from the flanks when an Imperial Guard unit is actually in battle. Now, the Sentinels were originally open-topped, but many are now enclosed in order to restrict the amount of gunfire the pilots will take, although it also does restrict their view, so they tend to be a little less manoeuvrable if they are ever in enclosed Sentinels. Now, one of the last light vehicles used by the Imperial Guard is the Taurus Rapid Assault Vehicle. Now, this is a sturdy all-terrain vehicle that's not actually very common in Imperial Guard units. It's more of a specialist vehicle adapted to serve with regiments such as the Elysian Drop Troops, who have to move very quickly and don't have time for armour to be transported in, and so can deploy the Taurus from a Valkyrie or other aerial vehicle, and then can be used to rapidly advance on the enemy. They are actually equipped with pintle-mounted weapons at the back, so an infantryman can fire at the enemy using primarily anti-infantry weapons to deal with the enemy as the vehicle advances. Now, accompanying the Taurus Rapid Assault Vehicle is a Taurus Venator, which means hunter in Latin, by the way, and it's a larger version of the Taurus with 6 wheels as opposed to 4, and it mounts heavy weapons to the back so that these rapid-moving infantry groups can actually advance quickly and still deal with light amounts of heavy armour if they do get in the way, and not be slowed down by having to wait for tanks, as mentioned previously. Now, those are the light vehicles I wanted to talk about, so we now can move on to the battle tanks and the other primary armoured vehicles of the Imperial Guard. Now, one of the most common tanks in the Imperial Guard is one that we'll all know, the Chimera APC, or Armoured Personnel Carrier. Now, it's the primary armoured infantry transport for the Imperial Guard. It's highly durable, practical, and its chassis has been used for many other versions of vehicle used in the Imperial Guard. This vehicle type has been in service for thousands of years, and some of its vehicles have lasted that long, rigorously maintained by the Adeptus Mechanicus, despite their relatively simple design comparative to some of the other vehicles used by the Imperial Guard. They can actually use multiple types of weapon from their turret on top of the vehicle, mainly anti-infantry weapons such as a multi-laser or autocannon used to deal with heavy infantry whilst they are actually transporting a unit of Imperial Guard soldiers. Now, these Imperial Guard soldiers in some versions of the Chimera can actually fire out of the back of the Chimera without being deployed, using gun slits to fire out at the enemy whilst embarked. They can also, of course, disembark via the top transport hatch or out the back of the rear transport hatch. Now, one of the first variants of the Chimera I want to mention is the Hellhound. Now, it's not a transport vehicle, unlike the Chimera, and it's actually armed with a large flame weapon known as an Inferno Cannon. This discharges lethal self-igniting chemicals to flush out enemy infantry in dense terrain and in urban combat situations. It's feared by many enemies because its ability to cover wide areas of the battlefield with flames and cause horrific losses to units. Even if the unit isn't killed, the damage done by the Inferno Cannon is horrific. There are two variants of the Hellhound called the Bane Wolf, which uses a chemical cannon used to corrode the enemy's flesh and organic matter with the chemicals, and the Devil Dog, which uses a melter cannon. This is more an anti-armour vehicle and is used to get up close and personal with enemy armour and melt through the vehicles using the specialised melter on top of the vehicle. Now, the one problem with the Hellhound is it does have some exposed cabling for the fuel fed into the cannon, and if it is breached by enemy armour, it can explode rather catastrophically when the chemicals inside the rear compartment are exposed to the open air. Now, another vehicle that uses a Chimera as a base is the Salamander Scout. Now, this is a small reconnaissance vehicle, and it is actually open top to the back. It's designed primarily for reconnaissance duties, and is lightly armoured but very fast comparative to other vehicles, so it can actually advance on the enemy, scout out any situations that may occur in front of an armoured column usually, and then can either communicate with the armour behind it or actually return in order to report on what's happening in front of a column. Now, a variation of the Salamander Scout is the Salamander Command Vehicle. Now, this is better equipped for command and communication, and is frequently used by armoured companies as HQ choices, and when they do not have access to some of the larger command vehicles available to the Imperial Guard. It also helps with forward spotting, with its powerful antenna actually able to collect information from forward scouts and relay it back to the primary command for an armoured column, even though it's not quite as well equipped to deal with scouting duties as the Salamander Scout. Now, moving on, we come to the primary tank of the Imperial Guard, that of the Leman Russ Battle Tank. Now, as you may know, this is the main Imperial Guard tank. It's rugged, dependable, and has been used for centuries. Whilst changes have been made in construction and appearance, it does look very similar to its original designs, which stretch nearly as far back as the Great Crusade. It can operate in a wide variety of environments and withstand a punishing amount of enemy fire whilst delivering powerful anti-tank blows. It is named after Leman Russ, the Primarch of the Space Wolves, although we don't know exactly why that is. Maybe he had a hand in finding the STC which the Leman Rus is based on, or maybe it's just to honour the Primarch who led some of the forces of the Imperium during the Great Crusade. Now, a Leman Russ battle tank has 4 to 6 crew on average, a driver, a loader, a gunner, and the tank CO, the other 2 crew being side sponson gunners if the Leman Russ does have side sponsons. Now, the main weapons of the Leman Russ battle tank is the battle cannon. Now, this is a 120mm smooth-bore gun, which can equally decimate enemy infantry and tanks. It has a water-cooled jacket surrounding the cannon, whilst geostabilizers ensure that the targeting is accurate while on the move, much like modern-day tanks, although I imagine the technology is rather different. Aiming the weapon is done through a dedicated periscope with a 45-degree field of vision, which isn't massive but useful when you know where the tank is pointing. It also has assistance from targeting gear, such as laser-based rangefinders. It can also use Auspex guidance to view the area around it, and crosswind indicators in case of long-range firing. Now, it does have hull-mounted weapons, which can be either a heavy bolter or a las cannon, and the side sponsons can be, as I mentioned, heavy bolters or las cannons used to deal with any infantry trying to approach the tank whilst it is engaging other enemy vehicles or other enemy units. Now, the Leman Rus has a wide variety of variants, and I'm going to go through some of the main ones now. There are a few which we don't really know much about or don't have much lore connected to them, so they've been skipped over in this, but if you do have any you would like to know about more, do let me know in the comments below. Anyway, as I was saying, the first Leman Rus variant I want to talk about is the Annihilator. Now, instead of a battle cannon, this has twin las cannons, and it is named for the Predator in the Space Marines Armoury, which has a similar setup, using twin las cannons to deal incredible damage directly to enemy armour, although damage to enemy infantry units is limited based on its weapons. The next variant is the Leman Rus Demolisher. Now, this is a siege tank equipped with a Demolisher cannon, much like the cannon on the Space Marine Vindicator, which fires short-range heavy ammunition into enemy emplacements and bunker positions, dealing massive amounts of damage to these buildings, although its effectiveness against light infantry and smaller enemies is relatively limited. Next up is the Leman Rus Conqueror, which uses a Conqueror cannon. Now, this is a shorter and lighter version of the battle cannon, and it reduces the power and range of the weapon, but allows the vehicle to move faster and fire more accurately, making it very versatile. It actually originated on the planet Griffon 4, which I will talk about at another time. Next up is the Leman Rus Eradicator. Now this uses a Nova cannon in place of a battle cannon. Now the Nova cannon is actually scaled down from the massive version used on Imperial Navy ships, and this is used to hyperaccelerate shells which in space are used to cause a massive amount of damage to enemy ships. On the ground, these smaller versions can be used to destroy barricades and people, although it's less effective within an atmosphere because the acceleration is blunted by the air resistance it does have to fight. However, it can deal incredible amounts of damage to very thickly armoured buildings or enemy vehicles, although it is a very rare vehicle. Another rare variant of the Leman Rus is the Lehmann Rus Executioner. It uses a large plasma cannon called a Plasma Destroyer, which is effective, but they do tend to explode due to their ill-understood nature, and the fact that a lot of the external cabling can be easily damaged even by enemy infantry, which will cause the cooling system to fail and the cannon to explode when firing. Of course, this is offset by the fact it does deal massive amounts of damage to the enemy. Next up is the Lehmann Rus Exterminator. Now this uses twin-linked autocannons, and it's used for infantry and light vehicles, so it supports more lightly equipped Imperial Guard Armour units, being one of the quicker Leman Rus variants and able to support them with heavy infantry fire whilst they are either retreating or advancing on an enemy depending on their mission. The second to last Leman Rus I want to talk about is the Vanquisher. Now this uses a Vanquisher cannon, a very long barrelled cannon which is very long range as well. It's used for long range armour penetration. It's actually quite a rare tank nowadays because its Forge World where it was originally manufactured was overrun, although some are still manufactured in small numbers on other Forge Worlds. However, that doesn't detract from the fact that the Vanquisher is one of a rare breed of Leman Rus that is dying out at the moment. Now the final Leman Rus I wanted to talk about was the Leman Rus Punisher. This uses something called a Punisher Gatling Cannon, and it's used to devastate enemy infantry units, so will usually be on the flanks of the Imperial Guard armoured divisions, going forward to deal with any infantry trying to overrun their positions, absolutely shredding these units, although their effectiveness against enemy buildings or against enemy vehicles is very low because the Punisher Cannon doesn't really have any armour penetrating capabilities. Now, we've come to the end of the Leman Rus variants. However, there are a couple more variants of a Leman Rus chassis that are used in the Imperial Guard. Now, the first of these is the Destroyer Tank Hunter. Now, this uses the powerful Laser Destroyer Cannon, which is hull mounted with a forward firing arc, and is used to hunt down enemy armour, and it's best used in defensive positions, or whilst ambushing armoured columns in city fighting. Knowledge of how to make the Laser Destroyer Cannon has actually been lost, and so the vehicle itself is dying out more rapidly than many of the others in the Imperial Guard because they just cannot manufacture them anymore. However, Destroyer Tank Hunters are still used, and despite having a locked firing arc because their cannon is mounted to the front of the vehicle, it does mean that they are less ponderous, have a lower profile, and can actually be quite effective at hunting enemy armour, although of course, as I said, because infantry can move too quickly, it can't really deal with anything that's lighter than itself in combat. Now, a variant of the Destroyer is actually the Thunderer Siege Tank, which uses the Destroyer's chassis, but because the Laser Destroyer Cannon may have been lost or damaged, it's been replaced with a Demolisher Cannon. Now, it's not as popular as the Leman Rus Demolisher because it doesn't have a rotating turret, the cannon is fixed to the chassis. However, it's got a much lower profile as mentioned with the Laser Destroyer, and so can approach in a more stealthy manner to buildings or bunkers that need to be dealt with, and can actually fire quite rapidly on the enemy. Of course, it is limited in usage, and generals do prefer to use the Leman Rus Demolisher, but the Thunderer Siege Tank is still used from time to time in the Imperial Guard. Now, moving on from the main armour we're going to go on to something called Self-Propelled Artillery. Now, this is something you may have seen out of any Second World War documentaries, where they are vehicles that can move around but have massive artillery cannons on top of the vehicle, so that they can provide immense amount of support whilst dealing a lot of damage to the enemy at the expense of its armour. Usually these vehicles are open-topped and can be easily damaged or destroyed by close-range infantry. The most well-known of the Imperial Guard self-propelled artillery is the Basilisk. Now, this is designed to provide medium to long-range fire support. If you've ever played a tabletop game, you'll know that for a period it had one of the longest ranges of any weapon in the board game. It's actually among the most numerous and well-known of the Guard's artillery, and is based on the Chimera chassis, although the back crew compartment has been completely removed as well as the turret, and has been replaced with an Earthshaker cannon for direct and indirect fire. The Earthshaker cannon itself uses 132mm shells to a range of over 15 kilometers and has a muzzle velocity of over 814 meters a second, which is incredibly powerful, although of course not the most powerful weapon that the Imperial Guards can bring to bear. Now another self-propelled artillery piece is the Griffon Heavy Mortar Carrier, which is based again on the Chimera and is a cousin to the Basilisk and Medusa tanks. It's designed to provide close to medium range artillery support, and can shell enemy infantry positions whilst being further back than maybe a demolisher, and can provide a lot of support to infantry units that are having to assault fixed positions. Next up is the Hydroflax Ank. Now this is an anti-aircraft vehicle based on the Chimera chassis, and it's employed when Imperial naval assets are unavailable for air superiority in the area. Now Hydras provide essential air protection for the regiment and can actually serve in a ground support role, with the cannons being lowered and firing at enemy infantry units. They actually use 4 long-barreled autocannons, although they can be loaded with a variety of different types of ammunition to deal different types of damage to aircraft and infantry, with using dispersed ammunition or maybe focused ammunition depending on the size of the aircraft. Now, the Manticore missile tank is another Chimera-based self-propelled artillery. It actually can fulfill a number of roles, from long-range bombardment to air defense, giving it great versatility over other platforms, although it does use Manticore missiles. They are versatile missiles ranging up to 30 kilometers, but their ammunition supplies are a lot lower than, say, the Basilisk, because of course they are larger and they're actually slower to load than some of the other self-propelled artillery in this list. Now the Death Strike missile launcher is a little bit of a variant of the Manticore, although not directly, and it is also based on the Chimera chassis. It uses Death Strike missiles, which are massive ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, with payloads that are strong enough to harm Titans themselves, massive walking units. Because of this, the Death Strike usually can sit on a completely different continent and actually deal damage during a battle, although of course it takes time for their missiles to reach the battlefield, and sometimes it's better to have instant support from vehicles on the ground, rather than waiting for a long-range strike to come in. Now the Medusa siege tank is another version of self-propelled artillery built on the Chimera chassis, which actually uses the Medusa siege cannon, a cannon that fires shells directly into an enemy fortification rather than using indirect fire to hit the enemy. It does however suffer from a number of disadvantages compared to other artillery pieces like the Basilisk or the Griffon, because it has a shorter range and is less mobile, and is more exposed, so it's preferred to be used from a secure position in cover, and is not so mobile when actually used in active combat. Now another piece of self-propelled artillery used by the Imperial Guard is the Minotaur artillery tank. Now the Minotaur is not based on the Chimera, funnily enough. It's heavily armoured and is armed with 2 Earthshaker cannons. It is a highly durable vehicle and is intended to operate in the heart of combat, providing fire support whilst under threat from enemy guns and redeploying under its own power. It's a very old vehicle and very rare, and there are records of them being used during the Great Crusade, so it's one of the older pieces of artillery used by the Imperial Guard. Because of its nature, it's much rarer to find on the battlefield, and is only really used when there is a dire situation which requires heavily armoured self-propelled artillery to enter the battlefield. Now the Bombard is one of the heaviest and most ancient pieces of artillery used in the Imperial Guard, reserved for campaigns when its super heavy siege cannon is required to penetrate enemy fortifications. However, it cannot move and fire, because the cannon itself is so powerful that if it did so, the aim would be shocking and it would probably damage the tank itself. Now the heavy siege mortar is a massive weapon. It's so heavy it must be mounted on a modified Lehmann Rus chassis, rather than a Chimera chassis. Now, it doesn't have the same range as an Earthshaker cannon, but the mortar makes up for it in sheer firepower, launching high-explosive concussion shells, which use their detonation shockwave to flatten buildings and crush enemy infantry and tanks, thus being able to deal with a wide range of enemies whilst still being able to redeploy at a moment's notice. Now next up I want to talk about the heavy vehicles of the Imperial Guard, which is a step up from the standard armour used by the Imperial Guard, and are also comparably a bit rarer because it's harder to get them to the battlefield, they're slower usually than other Imperial Guard vehicles, and they are also much rarer, so are tactically preserved until the combat is intense enough that they are required. Now the first vehicle I want to mention is the Crassus. It's an immense heavy armoured transport and can carry up to 30 infantry units. Now next up is the Gorgon Armoured Assault Transport. Now this is a heavily armoured trench warfare vehicle designed to transport a large number of troops across no man's land. So it's well covered and quite low to the ground, so it doesn't attract enemy fire. It's designed specifically for this mission, and the Gorgon has limited utility in other roles, being incredibly slow to turn, move, and it doesn't actually have that much speed. So if it was used in other situations, would usually be one of the first targets to be shot down because it's slow, quite obvious, and isn't able to provide itself the same protection as many other APCs. The next up is the Macarius, apologies for the pronunciation. This is a heavy tank named after Lord Commander Solar Macarius, and referred to as a second generation Baneblade, a tank I will mention in more detail later. This fulfills the same battlefield role as the larger Baneblade, but because the Baneblade is rare and tightly controlled by the Mechanicum, now Macarius has been used as a stand-in when the guard can't get hold of a Baneblade. It uses twin synchronized battle cannons as its primary weapon, and in relation to its other side sponsons and hull-mounted weapons, can deal a vast amount of damage to both enemy armour and enemy infantry units, although it cannot soak up as much firepower as the Baneblade and some of the other super heavies which sit above this on the vehicle scale. There are variations of the Macarius, namely the Vanquisher, which uses twin-linked Vanquisher cannons as mentioned above, the Vulcan, which uses the Vulcan Megabolter, which is a Titan weapon that fires thousands of bolt rounds a minute. If you want to know more about bolters, do check out my Space Marines Armoury video. The final variation I want to talk about is the Omega. This uses the Omega Pattern Plasma Blast Gun, another plasma-based weapon that can deal a vast amount of damage, although because it's a plasma weapon it does require a lot of cooling and can be quite dangerous to the crew who is using the vehicle. Now, the next heavy vehicle I want to talk about is the Malka Door, named after Malka Door the Sigillite, later Malka Door the hero from the Great Crusade, the second in command to the Emperor. This ancient design is still used by the Imperial Guard, although it's much older than the venerable Lehman Rus. It actually fulfills the same role as the Lehman Rus, although its size does move it up to the heavy category rather than standing as just an armoured vehicle. Its main battle tank role is compromised because it has limited turret movement. However, it is quite well armoured and its weaponry is also formidable, so it can't be discounted, even though Lehman Ruses are still preferred in modern fields of conflict. Now, the standard Malka Door does use a battle cannon, but there are other variations, much like the above vehicles, which can be fielded on the field of battle. Now, there is the Annihilator, which uses twin-linked las cannons, again much like the Predator of the same name, and has a hull-mounted Demolisher cannon, so it can deal with both buildings and with enemy armour, and is quite useful in the field of conflict. Next up is the Defender, which has 5 heavy bolters providing 360 coverage around the tank, which is suitable for close quarters combat and can support infantry units when moving in city warfare situations. There's also the Malka Door Infernus. Now, this tank uses a massive inferno gun similar to the one used by the Hellhound and can deal an incredible amount of damage to the enemy, but its drawback is it tows a large fuel trailer behind it where the chemicals are stored, and if of course this is punctured, it can explode rather spectacularly, destroying the Malka Door and any of the Imperial Guard who are using it for cover nearby. Now, the final Malka Door variant, and one of the final heavy vehicles I want to talk about before I move on to the super heavies, is the Malka Door Valdor. Now, the Valdor is the largest and oldest version of a tank hunter used in the Imperial Guard, which predates the destroyer tank hunter by many thousands of years. It also uses a completely different weapon, which is even rarer than the laser destroyer, and that is the neutron laser projector. Now, this weapon fires a projected neutron beam capable of destroying even the densest material by explosive matter disruption, smashing apart the target's molecular structure and creating a massive electromagnetic shock pulse, which can disable electronic systems. However, it requires a lot of energy, shielding, and also cooling. If any of these are disrupted whilst firing, it can cause the weapon to rather critically damage itself or injure the crew, and so the Valdor is not the most requested command for an Imperial Guard tank commander, despite the fact it is very, very useful on the field of battle. Now I've talked about the heavy vehicles, let's move on to the main attraction next to the usual armour, the super heavy vehicles. Now, this is what draw a lot of people to the Imperial Guard, just speaking out of lore of the moment, because they can field some of the more crazy super heavy vehicles that are used by the Imperial forces. Of course, there are some super heavies that can be used by the Space Marines nowadays, but of course the attraction for the Imperial Guard is just the variation you can have in your super heavies. Moving back to the lore now, the Baneblade is, as I mentioned, the primary super heavy tank used by the Imperial Guard, and is one of the largest and oldest tanks used by the Imperium. These massive machines often serve as command vehicles for entire regiments, or head up super heavy vehicle columns. Now, it uses a Baneblade cannon. This is a massive 10-metre long battle cannon, capable of launching rocket-assisted shells at targets many kilometres away. The power of this cannon is such that the tremendous recoil can rock the massive tank on its tracks, and produces a deafening roar inside the tank, in spite of the layers of armour and acoustic dampening material. A Baneblade is also armed with autocannons, hull-mounted demolisher cannons, hull and sponsor-mounted heavy bolters, and sponsor-mounted las cannons. Such a vast variety of weaponry that, while storing a huge amount of power, is fully within the capabilities of the Baneblade. And this essentially mobile fighting fortress can deal incredible amounts of damage to the enemy. I mean, its presence on a battlefield usually signals the end for many enemies, unless they have equivalent firepower. Now, the Baneblade chassis is the basis for most of the other super heavy vehicles used in the Imperial Guard, and I'll go through some of the variants now. Now the primary variant is the Shadow Sword. Now, based on the Baneblade chassis, it uses a Volcano Cannon, which is a 4 terawatt laser, very, very powerful laser, just for anyone who's wondering. This massive cannon can tear off a Titan's limb with a single shot, and assisted by an advanced Logis engine and targeting equipment for accuracy, can fire at very, very long ranges. The large capacitors needed to store energy for this weapon have to be mounted to a super heavy vehicle, because anything any smaller would not be able to carry the tremendous weight of the Volcano Cannon, which is usually attached to a Titan. Next up is the Storm Blade, which is a variant of the Shadow Sword, and uses a large plasma blast gun, which is a Titan killer, with a shorter range than the Volcano Cannon, but just as destructive at closer ranges, and it also is more reliable than the Executioner, because all the cabling and cooling can take place inside the tank, rather than on the exterior as it is with the Executioner. Next up is the Storm Sword, another Shadow Sword variant. This uses the Hellhammer siege gun to fire rocket-propelled siege shells, which have quite limited range. However, it does deal a lot of damage, and the protection offered by the Baneblade chassis will mean it is one of the primary siege weapons used up close against enemy fortifications when other vehicles aren't able to withstand the firepower. Now the Bane Sword is another variation and is modified to carry a Quake Cannon, which is a long-range artillery piece at Titan grade. Next up is the Bane Hammer. Now this uses a Tremor Cannon, which launches projectiles which bury themselves and detonate only after travelling some distance. On detonation, the shell releases a huge shockwave which liquefies nearby ground and forces enemy infantry and vehicles to literally crawl their way through or risk the consequences. Of course, if it's deep enough, the enemy will sink like in quicksand and can completely decimate entire regiments of enemies which stand against the Bane Hammer. Now the Doom Hammer is a retrofit of the Bane Hammer using magma cannons, which is based on a Volcano Cannon, although it's smaller, is weaker, but which can still damage Titans and is primarily used against other super heavies when the Shadow Swords are dealing with the Titans. Now the Hellhammer uses short-range fire support in difficult conditions like in city fighting. Now the main weapon is the Hellhammer Cannon. Now this uses shells that contain an unstable subatomic charge at their core, allowing them to smash apart enemy armour and emplacements because of the energy released when it impacts. However, its accuracy over range is limited. One of the last Baneblade variants I want to mention is the Stormlord. Now this uses a Vulcan Mega Bolter, which as I've mentioned previously can fire thousands of bolt rounds a minute. Now this is of course not used against enemy heavies. This is used to support the super heavy regiments and actually deals with any infantry units which are trying to attack the column itself. Of course, if an infantry unit is canny enough, it can do a lot of damage to a super heavy, so the Stormlord is on the outskirts, usually dealing with any that approach, helping keep the casualties due to minor annoyances down to the bare minimum. Now, one of the last super heavies I want to mention is not related to the Baneblade, called the Capital Imperialist. Now, this is 50 meters tall, and it's a tracked super heavy tank often used as a mobile command base for Imperial Guard regiments. It can carry 2 full companies of Imperial Guard, which is a lot of Imperial Guard. Although it is heavily armoured and protected by void shields themselves, which are of course used on Imperial Titans, they are so large and so slow that it limits the vehicle to defensive operations. Of course, it is armed and uses something called a Behemoth Cannon. Now, the Behemoth Cannon is so large that 4 Leman Russ battle tanks could fit within its barrel, and the concussive force of firing the weapon can produce a mushroom cloud and shake the earth itself. It's a standard cannon, but the size is so large it is used when city sieges are taking place. Finally today, I want to talk about the support vehicles of the Imperial Guard. Now, most vehicles in the Imperial Guard double up, the Chimera being a primary transport vehicle despite its battlefield role. However, there are a few dedicated support vehicles that need a mention. The full support vehicles of the Imperial Guard are the Atlas Recovery Tank. Of course, it's based on the Leman Rus chassis because lighter vehicles would usually not be able to carry some of the immense wrecks that are caused during Imperial Guard tank fighting. Another support vehicle is the Trojan support vehicle. This is a logistics vehicle based on the Chimera chassis, and the Trojan is primarily used as a towing tractor, so towing static artillery as I mentioned earlier, and it is also used as a supply vehicle. In addition to carrying supplies within their hull such as food, ammunition and spare parts, it can actually carry additional supplies in specialised trailers in order to reinforce the Imperial Guard behind enemy lines. Now, a few more specialised support vehicles are the Hades Breaching Drill. Now, the primary mission of the Breaching Drill is to either tunnel below enemy positions or breach fortifications. It's capable of cutting through just about any material. This includes bunkers, defensive structures, walls, vehicles, or even troops. It's usually used for rapid digging in the last few feet of a tunnel under the enemy lines, so that the Imperial Guard can pop up and start dealing damage to the enemy, without the enemy even realising that the Imperial Guard had got so far. Now, there are other digging vehicles used by the Imperial Guard, namely the Termite, the Mole, and the Hellboar. These are in size order with the termite being the smallest and the hellbore being the largest. These can move as underground drills and can transport troops inside to appear behind enemy lines, being transported under vast amounts of earth and rubble, whilst not causing too much of a tremor, and appearing quite rapidly to deploy behind the enemy itself. These are quite slow and can be dangerous depending on the enemy defences, but are still used by the Imperial Guard today as a method of infiltration, or even as a siege tactic if they are dealing with a very highly entrenched enemy. So, that's everything I wanted to mention today on the Imperial Guard vehicles. Of course, if you do have any suggestions for vehicles I might have missed, not including aerial vehicles, which will occur later, then do leave a comment below, or if you do have any other suggestions, you can go to the Vox Relay, which is the Vaults of Terra forums, which will be linked in the description below, where we take advice and look into people suggest what video should come next. So, if you are interested, do go there. Of course, next time there'll be another Space Marine video on a certain chapter, although we don't know what chapter that will be yet. We need you to vote on the forum or in the comments below as well. So we will then go to that chapter, then finish off the Imperial Guard Armoury with their equipment and some of the other elements of the armoury we haven't mentioned so far. So that's everything I wanted to mention today. See you next time on the Vaults of Terra.